Right, it is Thursday, which means we get to catch up on the big and important and meaningful stories of the week, the things that affect you, that affect me. And today we're going to be joined by two very special guests who I'm happy to have on the show. We'll get to them in a second. Got lots of ground to cover. What with the whole Russia-Ukraine situation, which is really dominating news at the moment, but also some local stuff, which is worthy of commentary. Also, part 3, Phumi, you must be so excited, of the state capture report. I know you are, because you read these things. Phumi is the only person I actually know who reads these reports, and therefore she's invaluable in the show because she's doing it for all of us. I mean, there's no way we would, right?
And this part 3 actually needs a weekend because it's over 1,000 pages long.
Oh my God. Is this the big clanger? This is the one that deals mostly with ESCOM, right?
Busasa.
Busasa. Oh my God. All right. No, we're in big trouble with this one.
Mostly
All right.
with
So
Busasa.
let me introduce our guests for this morning. I'm very, very happy to have him back. He hasn't been here for a while, and we have missed his input. Returning champion Mighti Jamie, a multi-award-winning international debating and public speaking champion and coach. Mighti Jamie, good to see you, sir. How are you? Jamie, can you hear us? Hello.
Doesn't seem like it. Hello.
Mighti Jamie.
Hello, Jamie.
All right.
He's very focused. He's so focused there, but he can't.
That's quite a scary. He's like looking at it. He's just staring us down. All right. Simpiwe she'll get busy sorting that out. And let's welcome Phil Craig in the meantime. Hey, Phil, how are you? You're not frozen, are you?
I hope not. I hope not. No, I'm in Wellington. We're very rarely frozen in Wellington. For those that know the area.
Well, I mean, you where you were located is particularly important when we talk to you, because Phil is, of course, a political and marketing strategist, columnist, political commentator, and also an advocate for Cape independence. So there he is with all the Cape independence stuff in the background. It's good to have you on, Phil.
Thank you. Nice to be back, Gareth, and nice to meet Phumi. I'm actually in awe of your 1,000 pages over the weekend, and wonder what else you're not going to get much fun that weekend, I'm guessing.
Well, you think that's impressive? Phumi also read your article on Russia and the Ukraine, so she's been reading up a storm.
Good.
All right, let's see if we can get. Hey, Jamie, can you hear us? Mighti Jamie, can you hear us? Oh.
Hello, Jamie. Now he's typing. I think he's typing a chat to tell us he can't hear us.
Okay, yes. Let me just see.
You can't hear for some reason. He'll join us.
All right, Pums, let's get Simpiwe on that one. And in the meantime, let's start off with what Phil wrote about lessons from Ukraine. This is your article.
Wait, before we start off with what Phil wrote, Phil, that's a very interesting accent you have there. Is that a Cape independent Cape accent?
No, it's not. It's become an independent Cape accent, but no. I was born in the UK, and I came to South Africa in my mid-30s and settled here. So no, I'm British by birth.
There we go.
Understood.
So Phil wrote an article, and we'll talk a little bit about Cape independence. I know that's your thing, and we'll talk about that just now. But you wrote this article about the Ukraine because you believe that the two topics are actually related: self-determination and imperialism. Obviously, these are words that get people fired up on both sides of the spectrum. The left are particularly concerned about colonialism and imperialism, and the right are particularly concerned with self-determination. So you're really crossing the political divide there with something that you believe is a lesson we can all learn. So tell me what you think of what's going on in the Ukraine. And when Jamie's on, I want to talk about South Africa abstaining from the vote, the very significant vote that was made at the UN this week. But before we get into any of that, sketch for us the background for this article.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, look, so I think it was just really that point of interest. So for us, as you say, in terms of Cape independence, self-determination is something that's important to us, and we don't always use those words. Increasingly, we're starting to talk about self-determination, but sometimes, although self-determination in an international context is a recognized and recorded human right, then sometimes in the sort of South African context, it can be misunderstood. So we're now looking in terms of the international context. But here, as the Ukraine Ukraine crisis unfolded, and I have to say I knew very little about the history of Ukraine and had to sort of do a fair bit of background reading. It was very interesting that you fell into this. That certainly at face value, this was about the secession of two territories, Donetsk and Luhansk. And they were pushing for self-determination, and Ukraine didn't want them to have self-determination. And then there was referendums that were held, and the referendums almost certainly weren't free or fair. But actually, the results of those referendums were then used as a justification by Russia to do what it. And I have to state now that I think Russia's conduct is deplorable, and there is absolutely no excuse for it for invading a sovereign state. So let's not be misunderstood on that. But in terms of our context of self-determination, what was interesting is that actually Ukraine hadn't really been playing by the rules either. And one of the interesting things in terms of the Ukraine is they've got a constitution that effectively prohibits self-determination. So in the Ukrainian constitution, the referendums can only be called by the national government, and referendums, everybody in the Ukraine is allowed to vote. So if you have a region of the Ukraine that wants to have some degree of autonomy, it needs the permission of the rest of the country, which of course removes the word self from self-determination. And all of a sudden you have parts of the Ukraine that have been denied self-determination. And then actually, and then you have this slightly farcical situation there where Russia then invades the Ukraine to protect somebody else's right to self-determination, and in doing so takes away Ukraine's right to self-determination. So it's just, and I think we wanted to set up this parallel to say, look, self-determination is the opposite end of the scale. Self-determination has been allowed to decide how you want to be governed yourself, and the sort of the rules by which the society you live in wants to live. And imperialism is deciding for somebody else what rules they must live by, and obviously that is what we're seeing in Ukraine. But in terms of coming back to the context of the Western Cape, there are a lot of parallels there. You've got the Western Cape that wants to live by a different set of rules to the rest of South Africa. The ANC government has exactly the same argument as the Ukraine, which is that Cape independence is a decision for all of the people of the Western Cape and not just a decision. So they also want to deny the Western Cape self-determination. And actually, we must also understand in this context that Cape independence is the extreme end of this. And in terms of self-determination, we're not really going to focus on today. I wouldn't really want to focus on independence per se. That would be our end goal. But there are much more practical things, and I think there are probably two that are worthy of note. First of all, we have this terrible crime problem in the UK. It's a terrible crime problem in the Western Cape. We've just lost another commissioner of police, the sixth in a row for some form of impropriety. Crime in the Western Cape is completely out of control. We've got a dysfunctional police force. So the Western Cape government is desperately trying to get control of the police. The Western Cape government, the DA, want to take control of the police in the Western Cape and manage policing differently. And the South African government is refusing to allow the Western Cape self-determination. It's refusing to allow the Western Cape to take control of the police force and manage itself, even though that's what the people in the Western Cape want. And another example is race-based policy. The Western Cape does not want race-based policy. They want non-racialism, as in the South African Constitution. Non-racialism is a founding provision of the South African Constitution. The Western Cape wants non-racialism, but the national government is forcing racialism onto the Western Cape against its will. And these are and Cape independence is the extreme solution to that. But just devolution of power, autonomy, federalism, which is the dominant political philosophy of the Western Cape. At more than 60% of the political parties are holding 60% of the power in the Western. Yeah.
Phil, you're speaking at 100 words a minute.
Sorry.
And
okay.
So many. No, that's okay. It's okay if that's how you speak. But there's so many thoughts that you've just rushed through for all of us, and I have so many questions. And I'm just like making a mental note.
Just before we even go into, because I do want to mine this a little bit more, and there is a lot to get into. I just want to bring Mighty Jamie on, because I know he was having trouble hearing us in the first two occasions, but he's here now. Mighty Jamie, nice to see you, and great to have you back, man. And an award-winning and multi-award-winning international debating and public speaking champion and coach, and a return champion to the Burning Platform. Jamie, it's good to have you on, and we kind of went straight into Phil because I was waiting for you to join. Can we, before we go into the similarities, between what you say is the Western Cape situation and maybe what you see in the Ukraine. Let's just talk about the Ukraine and Russia for a little bit. And Jamie, I know you've got some strong opinions on this. Do you want to throw that into the ring, and then Phumi can come with her questions afterwards?
Well, good morning, everyone, and I wonder if you can hear me just fine. Can someone
Loud
We
and
can
clear.
hear you perfectly.
Absolutely great.
Okay, that's
Cool.
great. That's reassuring. So I think for me, looking at it from an African perspective, I have to start off by pointing out that I was relatively surprised by the discrimination that occurred at the border as people were seeking refuge in Poland. I thought that the behavior of trying to say African migrants, a lot of whom actually have visas that are valid in the Ukraine, are working as professionals, they were being told that we're going to help the Ukrainians first, and then we're going to get to you. And that's a story that began to populate the social media platforms. And
Sorry, Jen,
initially,
you say you were surprised? You were
I was
surprised.
concerned.
You were not surprised.
I was concerned.
Okay.
I was concerned, and I was actually surprised as well, to be honest, because in the middle of all of this, everyone is talking about freedom. They're talking about democracy. So they're talking about principles, territorial integrity. And one of the principles which we have is one of the principles of equality of human beings. That Black people, white people, East Europeans, West Europeans, all of them enjoy dignity inherently, and because they enjoy dignity inherently, they are equal in the eyes of other human beings. But it seemed that as people were exiting or trying to save their lives, which is what refugees are trying to do, they have a legitimate fear of persecution, a legitimate fear of death, which is why they seek refuge. It's not necessarily about what is your nation state at the time that you're seeking refuge. There's an ongoing invasion. You think that your life is at risk. You want to save your life. And the fact that African migrants were being told, go to the back of the line, and they were freezing. And I think looking at all of that, it really showed me the weakness of Africa on the global stage. Having said that, though, this to me seems like a contestation of a geopolitical nature and a contestation for the hegemony of global power, because Russia is making a move to reestablish its position as a geopolitical power. I mean, it's been doing that for a while. When they assisted in Syria to prop up the Assad regime, that was a power play, one that pushed Obama out, actually. And now what they're doing, and this is my analysis of it, is that Putin has had aspirations to reestablish some version of the Russian Empire for a while. And the reason why he chose to do it in 2022 was simply because a lot of the Western leaders are not in positions of strength in their home states. So if you look at Joe Biden, he's facing
very low
midterm, low approval ratings one, and a blowout in the midterms. So if you're Putin, this is a good time to test the Americans.
I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, Jamie, because that's such a valid point. I mean, Putin's been saying he's going to do this for the longest time. And unlike most politicians, he's actually done what he said. I'm not saying that he's an honorable man, but at very least, that puts him in a position.
Bluff.
Yeah, he's not like everyone else in the Western world who's like, bah, 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 but you never know what to believe, right? And is there anyone in the Western world? We've got Boris bumbling around at number 10 Downing Street. We've got Joe Biden dribbling and eating porridge in his State of the Union speech. We've got Justin Trudeau behaving like more of an autocrat than some would say even Vladimir Putin has inside his own country when it comes to protests he doesn't like or people whose opinions he doesn't approve of. Who in the Western world is strong enough to actually go to Putin and be taken seriously and have the kind of balls that he had to do, even though it's an awful thing, as you and Phil, I'm sure, are in agreement that he's gone and invaded the Ukraine. It's morally unconscionable what's happened, but at least he's done what he said he was going to do, which we can't say for any of those Western leaders, right? Is there one of them that you would respect if you were Putin?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is that I think we just have to, be careful of equivocating. So what Trudeau did with the truckers and the bank accounts and the protesters, that was definitely draconian and not in line with liberty. But it's quite far removed from literally invading a country and going to war. So I mean, it just degrees. But I take your point that it wasn't in line with civil liberty.
Justin Trudeau, as you say, he's facing all kinds of opposition at home. Biden's doing the same. I think post COVID. Macron is having a tough time too. There isn't really anyone, and Angela Merkel's exited stage left. So who do we have left? Who do we have left to kind of guard? And who's in charge at NATO? Bunch of old men.
Well, the interesting thing is that sometimes it has. The interesting thing is that sometimes when you have a situation such as this, or if you think even about Survivor, a group of weak people can eliminate strong players if they bandy together. So I think Putin was correct to make an analysis that all of these leaders are weak for various reasons. Trudeau, Biden, Boris, all of them will go, and the German chancellor, who's very new in the position and doesn't have the experience and relationships that Angela Merkel would have had. But it does look as if they've come together, to try to definitely have the last kick of the dying horse of Western powers, so to speak. So they have been as effective as they can be in terms of trying to push back without engaging in a military confrontation. And part of that, and Putin has been thinking about this for a very long time, which is why he chose Ukraine as one of his strategic points of attack, is that NATO cannot necessarily have legitimate grounds to get involved in the fights because Ukraine is not a member state. And at the same time, you always have to be worried about the risk of escalation to a nuclear level. And he came in very forcefully, he kept the nuclear option on the table, and he has also anticipated sanctions and a variety of interventions. And with the alliance of China, he has been able to mitigate some of those risks. So while there's a lot of reporting around, these banks are sanctioned, these individuals are sanctioned, this oligarch's yacht got seized, I think that Putin has actually factored in all of these risks and is moving ahead, knowing that there's almost a realignment at this point.
So it's interesting you bring that up. I'm sorry to hog the questions here. I haven't spoken to Jamie for a while. So you're saying that none of these things are necessarily going to deter him so far, even though we know there's huge pressure on the Russian ruble, on the stock market. There are groups of people at home. I mean, St. Petersburg has been full of protesters. You don't think any of that's going to deter him?
No, not necessarily. I think Putin is committed to this. He came across as very committed when he made the public address telling everybody that they won't even get a chance to blink. I think that, and when he's made addresses around, activating nuclear options, he is very serious about this. And I mean, Russia is one of the biggest chess playing countries in the world. So I think a lot of these variables and scenarios would have been factored in already. And because China is also on his side, I think that what he offers them is a strong aggressor on the international stage, while they can ascertain what is the risk of taking over Taiwan. But the game has definitely changed. And last year, China actually started flying its military aircraft into the Taiwan airspace. And they did so even though America tried to send its military cruiser ships there to try to say, listen, this is a provocative act, but they did not stop. But in the early 90s, when China flew into the Taiwan airspace, Bill Clinton sent some boats there and they de-escalated. But right now, China has accelerated its invasion of the Taiwanese military airspace. All of this indicates that right now, you have China, which has its eyes on Taiwan. You have Russia, which has its eyes on several territories, which it views as being part of the Russian nation state legitimately, even though there's a debate about that. But right now, even if you were to say to Putin, we're going to take these steps, but also critically, the banks that are involved in the gas economy have not been sanctioned. They are not out of SWIFT. So Putin also knows quite well that everyone is actually depending on him. And we all see the footage. It's snowing in Europe. And everyone who are standing in those lines rushing into Poland has to supply heat. They have to get enough energy for heat. And so Putin chose this particular time with specificity, strategically, and with a high level of deliberateness that I think we have to factor in as much as we assess all of these sanctions and other measures that have been taken.
Gareth, why are you showing me?
Well, because I'm sure that you have lots. We've laid the table. We've laid the table here for you, Phumi. Now you can eat. Phil's told us his story. Jamie's told us his take on the thing. And I know you're brimming over with questions. Plus, I've hogged the first couple of minutes. So go ahead.
Goodness, I don't know where to start. I don't know whether to start with Mighty Jamie's surprise at something that was so obvious. in terms of how migrants would be treated at the borders. African migrants are always treated that way, no matter where they come from. And, you know, when we saw the reporting, I don't know why people are surprised or shocked at all, actually, because this is what we get, right? This is what we get for weak leaders in Africa.
You've also been to Russia, and let's not pussyfoot around this. I mean, Russia is not a country that knows a huge amount about black people, or is particularly well known for being.
Y'all, they don't even see them. They don't see black people.
Right.
I told you the story when I came back from Russia, but I mean, I think it's silly to be surprised that people would be treated that way. I think it's silly to be surprised that the feedback that we would get from all sorts of media, left and right media, is, oh my goodness, all realized country in Europe. This is the kind of thing that happens in like backward places like Africa. And I'm like, what the hell? That's absolute rubbish. And I mean, I think it's a perfect place of convergence with what I wanted to ask Phil earlier, just in terms of when you did your research. And I love the fact that when you started your article, you were honest about the fact that you didn't even know where these territories are or what they were about, and you needed to do research. So I'm interested to know how far back your research went. You know, when did you start? Because, you know, I've spent the better part of the past 10 days doing a lot of reading, not just about that region, but just about conflicts in Europe. So I'm interested to know where you started, because I think that you have a very narrow view of what that war is about or why it's happening.
Well, in all honesty, I think the article is less about the war, and the article is about self-determination and imperialism. So effectively, we're using the Ukraine, the current situation, which at face value is over exactly these issues, to discuss the concept of self-determination. So, it's, in terms of research, that yes, we've spoken to historians, and I've got a good overview of the situation, but I don't claim to be an expert on Eastern European history. I understand the basics. Our issue is around the right to self-determination, which is a recognized human.
But let me ask a question then, Phil, because to me it's all about zooming in or zooming out. You don't have to know a lot about the Ukraine and Russia to know that self-determination is an issue for people if you zoom in enough. For example, here you're saying that the people of Donetsk and Luhansk, for example, are looking for self-determination from the Ukraine. But the Ukraine is looking for self-determination from Russia if you zoom out further. So it's not clear who the bad guys are and who the good guys are, if you don't mind me pointing that out.
No, sure. Well, look, and I think that was the crux of the article, that actually at some point you have to go to principle. And I think from our position here, we're saying, look, self-determination isn't a nice to have. Self-determination is a founding provision of the United Nations. It's guaranteed in the Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. It's in the Constitution of the African Union. It's in the Constitution of South Africa. And self-determination is something that is critical. It's critical to avoid conflict. It's critical that people have, if you want to have meaningful democracy for people and you want to recognize people's human rights, then self-determination is something that is important. And yes, just as with all, like with the right to freedom of speech, for argument's sake, that there are going to be conflicts within that right, and there's going to have to be common sense. And I think if we look at Ukraine, then Ukraine itself absolutely has the right to self-determination as a sovereign state, and so do people and communities within the Ukraine, and actually those rights have to find a way of coexisting.
So let's zoom back into South Africa then. Let's zoom back into South Africa and your premise in the article being around South Africa and that the Western Cape, and there are two parts which I come to understand as your premise for why self-determination is the reasoning that you would call for a referendum and therefore a secession of the Western Cape. And the first one being that South Africa is a unitary state, which is blatantly incorrect. We're not a unitary state. I mean, it's in paragraph 40.1 of the Constitution. All the provinces have legislative executives and therefore are able to make decisions for their provinces. It's the reason why the Western Cape can have the DA. And it's the reason why democracy works. It's in order to be able to have a responsive government, people are allowed to vote provincially, nationally, locally, right down to a municipal level. And all of those areas have got an interdependence, yes, but also they have their own executive, own legislative executive that allows them to make decisions. So if I mean, that is a flawed premise to begin with.
Well, no, I disagree with you. That South Africa is
What
a
do you
quasi.
disagree with? That the
South Africa.
Constitution says we have a provincial legislative executive. Is that what you disagree with?
No, I don't disagree. South Africa
Okay.
is what's called a quasi-federal state. It has the appearance of
By
federalism.
whom?
But well, in terms of the definition, if you look at the definition of a quasi-federal state, because whilst we have got provincial legislatures, they have very, very limited powers. So the people of the Western Cape. So let's take the Western Cape first of all and say the majority of Western Cape voters. Since 1994, so for 3 decades, the majority of Western Cape voters have never been governed at a national level by the party they vote for. They actually are and they live under ideologies and policies which they object to, but they have no way of ever being governed in the way that they want to be governed. The Western Cape has the national policies.
That is an oversimplification. That is an oversimplification.
It's not. It's a fact. It's not an oversimplification. It's an absolute fact. If you go and look at the IEC data, you will see that the majority of people in the Western Cape have never been governed by the government they elected, they voted for, and they realistically have no prospect ever. And actually, you've got a situation
I need the numbers. Now. I need you to give me numbers of what the majority. So the DA for the past 2 voting seasons has been in power in the Western Cape, right? So I need numbers. I don't want us to talk kind of like.
But the ANC vote peaked at 44% in the Western Cape. So there you go. So they've never had a majority in the Western Cape, even though they've been the national government for 30 years. In the last elections last year, the ANC got 20.4% of the vote. And actually, in the last national elections, they got 28.6% of the vote. But the ANC is dictating policy to the Western Cape, and the provincial government you're talking about is actually fighting for control of the police, and the national government is saying no. They want to get rid of race-based policy. The national government is saying no. They want control of transport. The national government is saying no. The people, in the Ukrainian crisis, the Western Cape government lit up its National Assembly in yellow and blue in support for the Ukraine,
and they were allowed to do that. And they were allowed to do that. Nobody came and shut them down from doing that. They were allowed to do that.
Okay, but it's not just about.
So hold on. Can I ask you a question? So sure. Each province, and this is what interrelated is about, right? Is each province has a mirror. We have a 3-tier system in this country, and each province has a mirror of what the national government is like. So there is an MEC for safety in the Western Cape, right? And that person is responsible for the budget of safety in the Western Cape. That person is a DA appointee. So what is it that they need permission from the national government to do with their budget? Well, look, I think that's why I'm saying to you that I think the premise of your argument is based on the fact that you believe South Africa to be some kind of quasi-federal state, whereas the government, as what it is based on our constitution, is not that.
Okay, I disagree wholeheartedly.
Guys, can I just let me bring Jamie in, because he's got a couple of questions. And I also don't want us to get stuck in the idea of devolution of power. And because I know, Phil, this is your thing, and I will give you another chance to explain your position and kind of have the argument about Cape independence. But there are other things that people are talking about right now which seem to supersede this otherwise luxury discussion. In a time of necessity. Jamie, you had a question, and I'm happy to bring you in on this, and then we can move on.
Yeah, so just 2 things, actually. Number one is that when we think about the context of anybody seeking self-determination, we also have to be aware of the history. And that history is relevant to assessing whether or not those claims are legitimate. So this is just to engage Phil's article a little bit, because number one, the people who are Russian speaking in the Donbas region were put there basically by Russia in two different periods. Under Catherine the Great, there was a period of exclusion of Ukrainian ethnic Ukrainians and the inclusion of Russians into that territory for the purposes of pushing ahead the Russian colonial agenda. And then secondly, there was a genocide which occurred called the Holodomor, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, where millions of ethnic Ukrainians were basically died, and that population of Russians came into the territory. So the Donbas region actually has a troubling history in that the people who are there now wanting to separate and rejoin Russia are actually there as a result of a very, very, I think, illegitimate set of actions. One, a genocide, and two, forced expulsion under Catherine the Great in the 19th century. So that begs the question that if they seek to have, an independent state from the state of Ukraine, are those claims necessarily legitimate? Is the historic claim that Ukraine has on that territory extinguished by the actions which were taken by Catherine the Great and Stalin and several other Russian emperors over the course of history? But going to the second level, I'm just curious, and this is the question that I wanted to ask. I've heard a lot about, racialist policies coming from a national level, which the Western Cape doesn't necessarily want to implement. I'm curious what those are, and I'm curious what specifically about policing does the Western Cape government want to do that is different? Because the issues of policing are interrelated. Number one, we all know that there's a lot of gang violence in the Western Cape. Western Cape is one of the murder capitals of South Africa, actually, in the Cape Flats and in several townships. So what do they want to do that is different? And number two is they are socio-economic drivers of crime. When you have low levels of education, when you have low levels of welfare support, things which the Democratic Alliance can do now. When you look at the matric results, the Democratic Alliance led Western Cape doesn't actually do much better than the ANC-led provinces in terms of education. In fact, the Gauteng results had more bachelor's passes over the last 5 or 6 years than the Western Cape. So I'm curious around the socio-economic stuff. What are they going to do differently when they're independent?
I don't want us to get lost in the reads here. So I'm going to.
I know. It's just.
Yeah. And I understand also that this stuff does need context. And just before you answer, Phil, because there's quite a lot that Jamie's asked you here. With self-determination, like I said, it's a question of zooming in or out, depending on what you want to look at as independence. Because what if a municipality in the Western Cape decides it wants to declare itself a sovereign state? How seriously must we take that? And then the same goes for history. If we're starting to look at Catherine the Great, and we do need to have context for these things, that's 1780. Again, people zoom in or out of history, just like they zoom in or out of geography, in order to strengthen their narrative. This happens in every argument, and that's why these things are not necessarily intelligent discussions. If all we're doing is cherry picking, you might be for the Cape independence movement. Jamie might be for an argument against whether or not Luhansk and Donetsk are really Russian-speaking areas. You know what I mean? It's all kind of academic when you start doing this stuff. So
Gareth, the only thing that's permanent in politics is interests. That's the only thing.
Yes,
friends
correct.
and enemies change.
Correct.
So it's really about looking at the self-interest of the people and what they are propagating.
So go ahead.
But the holistic history is relevant. We can't forget that holistic history because it informs whether or not, as an individual, you should.
I'm not criticizing Phil or you, Jamie. I'm just saying that these things zoom in or out and the whole story changes very often. So go ahead, Phil. You need a chance to answer these questions. Go ahead.
Sure. There's a few there. So look, first of all, I agree wholeheartedly with Gareth, and I think if we look at that article that I've shared, we are arguing for the principle to apply and to not be applied selectively. That's actually the thrust of the argument, that you can't pick and choose when you apply the principle depending on whether it's politically expedient or not. And we're arguing that the right to self-determination is an absolute right, and actually it doesn't really matter whether it's your team or the other team. You actually have to apply that principle fairly and equitably. So I agree with that, and I'm glad you picked up on the historical context. Of course, historical context is important, but it can't possibly be more important than using the popular experience of lived experience of the people who are in that region now. They are the people who are alive today. They are the people who have got a right to self-determination. They have a right to democracy, and actually that isn't negated by something that happened that was done. And in a South African context, this is absolutely critical. Something that was done by their forefathers centuries before cannot negate the rights of people who are living here and now in whatever territory it is, which includes South Africa. In terms of what the DA want to do with the police, so let's bring that back to the specific points. That is kind of up to the DA. The argument here is that the DA is the duly elected government of the Western Cape. There clearly is an issue with policing in South Africa, and it's fine to just say there's a national competency, but the South African police service is in disarray. I don't think anybody can argue that. We can look at how many people are being fired, just how appalling the level of service on a if we have global comparisons is. So something dramatically has to be done, and the Western Cape is the murder capital of South Africa. It's not one of it, it's the worst. And you've got a situation where the Western Cape government saying is, look, we understand what goes on the Western Cape. We want to have control and deal with these specific issues. We don't agree with the way it's been policed at a national level, and the national police are incompetent. We've been elected in the provincial elections on a mandate of having more control over the police, of having oversight, or more than oversight, having control of the police in the Western Cape. We want the power of policing devolved from national government to provincial government, and they have been democratically elected on that ticket. So therefore, they must themselves say what they want to do with that power. But actually, clearly, they believe that they can. Hang on a second. Clearly, they believe that they can improve policing. Now, actually, what you've got, and in the meantime, they've gone and set up this LEAP officers have actually gone and recruited their own police force, which is and they've had great success with that. And we've had a debate of that in the National Council of Provinces, and the Western Cape government is asking for the budget to be devolved so they can police at a provincial level.
I have to just close this discussion. I know you got a ton more to say, Phil, but I think we're all agreed that policing is probably more of a local issue than it is a national issue. So even just on the basis that if any of us were running the government, we'd probably want police to be decided within neighborhoods, within communities, within municipalities, long before.
Which is why we have provincial police commissioners who are accountable to the premier, which is why we have metropolitan police in cities who are accountable to the mayor.
But at the risk of sounding really insensitive, I don't believe that the reason I've gathered all of us here this morning is to just talk about policing in the Western Cape. So let's look at the Supra situation for a moment. Let's just, kind of go zoom out, as I said earlier. South Africa didn't vote at the UN in this move against Russia. What do you all feel about that? Do you feel that, that's what we expected from South Africa? Is it clear that Russia is the bad guy here and that we should have voted with the other countries? There's an interesting point made by Kanthan Pillay, who's often on the show with us, about...
I just saw that.
Did you see it, Phumi? The populations of the world. He reckons if it was a show of hands in terms of the population of the world, 43% would have voted against Russia, because most of those countries that voted in abstention or against are actually
didn't show up
were the most populous countries. So there are lots of things to discuss here. Jamie, do you see a clear good, bad situation? Do you think South Africa acted appropriately?
Well, I think that this vote exposed the tension that was already below the surface, because if you recall, the Department of International Relations came out very strongly saying that, listen, the sovereignty and territorial borders should be respected. And then Sunday Times started reporting that Cyril wasn't very happy with that. And then we had the Minister of Defense attending a Russian event celebrating a historic moment, some soldier ceremony. And then just after that, the ANC released a statement seeming to be leaning towards the Russia side in as much as it was trying to de-escalate the Naledi Pandor approved statement. So I think South Africa is part of BRICS. There's Russian money that has been taken by South Africa, and the relationship that the ANC has with Russia is a historic one, and one that the ANC does pay a lot of heed to its historic alliances around the world, people who supported the apartheid struggle and all of those things. So it's not a simple thing to say to the ANC-led government that vote in favor of Ukraine, because currently the Western Bloc is pursuing that agenda. And as much as Mr. Ramaphosa was, with the G7 and, very, cordial and affectionate with them in the pictures last year, there's still a lot of historic attachment to places like Russia, strategic attachment. Being a member of BRICS is not a trivial thing. So that vote, I think, was very inevitable. And it actually shows that the geopolitical considerations in terms of which is the hegemonic state and what is the power balance on the global stage is very much in flux. And countries like South Africa being able to resist the pressure from the West actually just does show that China and Russia have created a rift in the geopolitical balance of forces. So as much as you had these 140 something countries, taking the line, the abstentions were very significant, and the no's also was significant, of course. So I think we are in a moment now where the West will have to go back to the drawing board and really think about the dynamics of their influence on the global stage. And I think another thing is that some of the African states may have voted, against Russian aggression, but they are very much under the control and influence of China. So if you were to extrapolate that a little bit further, you would actually see that not only in population terms was it a refutation of the Western control, but also some of those votes below the surface were just they were yes votes, but they were effectively abstentions if you pay attention to the dynamics.
Well, Phil, do you feel that South Africa voted appropriately by abstaining, or is this another kind of moral cowardice?
No, I think moral cowardice is exactly what it is. I think it's a question of putting your national political interests above an important principle. So no, I'm disappointed, but not entirely surprised. I think South Africa, on the principle that one country has invaded another, should have stood against that. Look, I accept there are issues. I don't think any issue is entirely black and white or right or wrong. And I think there's far more nuances than just good guy, bad guy. But clearly, in a situation where one country has invaded another and attacked its territorial sovereignty, that should have been condemned.
Pums, what do you think? Because you and I were having a conversation about this in the first hour of the show, and it seems to me like
South Africa's stuck.
Yeah,
I think South Africa's stuck between the West and the East, right? And it's kind of like they are not sure where their best interest lies. So it's easier to just kind of be in the middle and say, I'm not going to say anything on this one, because South Africa historically has had Russian support, has had a lot of support from the East, and today it has a lot of support from China and part of BRIC. So they don't know if they must all out say we're for Russia, Russia is right in what they're doing. Because when the Eastern Bloc fell in 1990, they made a decision to jump to the West. And that's why they were able to enter into negotiations. And that's what ushered in the new South Africa that we live in now. So, and now the West is looking a little bit weak. They have friends in the East, even though they want to be with the West. That's why Cyril Ramaphosa showed up at G7 and looked so chummy with everybody. But this pull on both sides keeps them unable to make a decision. And unfortunately, I think that even the whole world is stuck in this vicious circle of East and West and where the power lies at any one time. But power is being disintermediated now. The power has moved. It's no longer East and West, guys. And I think that technology has changed all that.
We could maybe do a better job of not looking like we're making it up as we go every step of the way and just like, falling over our own feet, which is what the Department of International Relations and then later the presidency had to rectify, because we can't seem to be able to speak clearly, even if it's within government. Forget about without. There may be many people in this country who are pro-Ukraine, pro-Russia, who knows? And there may be all kinds of reasons that we should be one or the other. But the fact that our government cannot speak with one voice about this just shows you how completely ineffective the channels of communication in both the Department of International Relations and the presidency seem to be, and how they seem to be working in different directions so much of the time. It's embarrassing to see this. And I don't know how many countries in the world take us seriously when we have something to say about Russia or the Ukraine, because as we discussed at the beginning of the show, Pums, we had a lot of moral capital once with Thabo Mbeki and Nelson Mandela. We had a lot of international sway, and we were regarded as a country that could speak with authority, if not authority, certainly with morality and with a set of principles that the rest of the countries in the world probably were a little bit envious of it at a certain point. That's not there anymore, and we seem to have squandered a lot of that. What do you
have
guys?
a president who can't call his cabinet to order.
Absolutely.
I mean, he is the president, for crying out loud. He needs to set the tone for what our international policy is, where are we going as a country? And he's unable to even just pick up the phone and say to Naledi Pando, hey, girl, you're out of line on this one.
Right.
The hell? Instead, we hear it through the newspapers. We see it
But
reported in the papers.
This is something we've spoken about with Cyril a million times. He doesn't take the initiative. He tries to get everyone around the table and reconcile everybody. It's his background. So, guys, let's talk about the state capture report, which Phumi is the only person who's going to set aside a weekend to read. But Jamie, Phil, are you guys excited about the state capture report at all? Is there anything in there that you're looking for particularly? And what do you think will happen after this? Because it's part 3 of 3. Jamie, you go ahead first.
So I think the first thing is that I think the state capture report is not going to see a lot of implementation because of the number of people who are implicated. And the further you go down the rabbit hole, the more you see the immoral, unethical relationships between companies, between politicians, between the state, and all of these deals that were made. So I think that it's going to be useful more in 2 respects. One, thinking about structural reform. I don't think you'll get a lot of that structural reform whilst the ruling party is the ANC, simply because they benefit from the status quo. And number 2, I think it's going to benefit opposition parties because they are the ones who will be able to go into these 4 volumes, if it's going to even be 4, and point out the nexus of relationships between, like, for instance, consulting companies, accounting companies, all of these different high net worth individuals who are playing the lobbying game or the political largesse game for benefication of their own businesses and themselves. So I think that you'll see all of the opposition parties will be able to extract different points to point out. But I think as an exercise in accountability and an exercise in getting some kind of retribution, if you will, we're not going to get that necessarily, simply because even now the ANC is speaking about how they're going to try to deal with this with the Integrity Commission, as opposed to through the prosecutorial arm. Of course, there's a lot of rhetoric about how the state prosecution will follow through on this, but we know that all of the stuff that is in the Zondo report is not necessarily admissible in a court of law. You have to almost build up your evidence file from scratch, and that's going to be part of the problem. So I think as an exercise, a lot of people are going to feel that the $1+ billion that was spent was not necessarily well spent, because you do implicate Zuma, but he's on the outside of the political space. He's basically now, in retirement, and all of the people who are
He's
active
on medical
players.
parole.
He's on medical parole, but also like he's like, I don't think he's going to be a major player in politics for the next 10, 15 years. But all of the young people who are major players currently on the chessboard or on the soccer pitch or on the rugby pitch, if you will, those people are not going to be facing any prosecutorial outcomes as a result of them admitting that they took loans from certain entities, that they took money from Bosasa or whatever the case may be. So if everyone who's on the board can still play the game unfettered, I think that you have to question whether or not it was worth the bang for buck. But I do think that opposition leaders will be able to build a case around how the ANC holistically has been implicated, how cadre deployment is a problematic policy. Whether or not they've already proven that case and this doesn't necessarily help them is a different debate. But I think it maybe gives more ammunition to say, we already told you that these things don't work.
Phil, what do you think? Are you excited about this third part of the state capture report? Did you even bother with the first two? And what do you think we will learn out of this? I mean, a lot of the stuff we've seen in action as we've actually watched the stuff unfold in front of Judge Zondo. But do you agree with Jamie? There won't be any real action from this?
Sadly, I do. I think what we've got here is, I think the state capture report is an absolute damning indictment on the ANC and the government of South Africa, which has been the ANC since 1994. And I think what this report has done is it's kind of put some flesh on the bones and exposed the truth. But it's a truth that we've all known. Every one of us understands that the ANC is corrupt to its very core, and actually our system is, as a function of that, is broken. But what's happened is whilst state capture has been going on, then people have still had to decide which side of the fence do they fall on. And actually, some people, doesn't really matter what evidence they're going to be presented with, are going to end up still backing the ANC. And we saw even at the end of the State Capture Commission in the local government elections, the ANC may have got a bit of a bloody nose in certain places, but it was still by far the largest party with more than double the votes of its nearest rival. And that is not just a damning indictment on the ANC government, it's a damning indictment on the South African electorate. And I don't think anything is going to change. We're not going to see mass prosecutions. We're just going to see business as usual. We are starting to see a restructuring of South African politics, and that's a different discussion. And this will probably accelerate that. But we aren't going to see people in orange jumpsuits. We aren't going to see the ANC fundamentally change course. We are going to see the start of this realignment of South African politics. But everybody's known what's been in the State Capture Commission for years. Some of them want to deny it.
I think that what we are going to see is we're going to see a rise of private prosecutions. And besides the fact that we have a saga, we have an AfriForum that goes after certain things, we're going to see a rise in private prosecutions. Busi Mavuso of Business Unity South Africa has been on a very big roadshow. I mean, I think she also had a meeting with Shamila Batoyi, just in terms of what the private sector can do to support and help see some prosecutions come to light after the state capture report. There was a report 2 weeks ago, actually, about the fact that over the past 5 years, including the State Capture Commission, government has spent something like 1.5 billion rands on legal fees. So there's still going to be lots and lots of very rich lawyers. If you are in the legal fraternity, there is a boom happening currently, and it is going to continue for a long time.
That's why they have all those brand new buildings in Sandton, right, Phumi?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think what the State Capture Commission reports also give to the South African, the gift that the report is for South African politics, is for a clever strategist in any one of these opposition parties. It allows you to shoot fish in a barrel, essentially, because you're able to pick strategic spaces that you would like to make an impact in, recruit people, which is what Action SA has been doing specifically for those areas. And we can learn a lesson from Putin. I told you guys last week that when Putin first came into, as he was rising up the ranks, before he even started his own political party, he fired 2,000 people and hired a whole lot of his own sympathizers, a whole lot of people who have the same mindset as him. There's an opportunity, I think, for opposition parties to be strategic about the way that they tackle what's coming in the next election.
Right. So we've only got a couple of minutes left. America, for whatever it's worth, is still the country that calls itself, the hegemon, or certainly political analysts have been calling it that for the longest time. Something, again, you referred to earlier, Jamie. And their president was making a State of the Union speech just a couple of days ago, yesterday. And there seems to be no discussion around this at all. Of course, for him, and he is going through a very, very difficult time. He's only been in office for a year. And I cannot imagine that even the most sympathetic Democrat in the United States is able to find enough things for him to boast about in his first State of the Union. And he was meant to be the antidote to the craziness of the Trump era. There's a damp squib, and its name is Joe Biden. But luckily for him, along has come a very convenient war, which can be used to distract people. How cynical am I to expect that Joe Biden's State of the Union speech would have been anything but Russia and the Ukraine when there's so little to boast about domestically? Or am I being unfair? Anyone can go in on this one. Who wants to go first?
Well, I don't think the war is going to help him much in terms of the midterms. I think a lot of people view his response to not have been maybe as robust as other leaders that have held the seat before. So I think he's still going to get a tough, what is it called, a shellacking in the midterms. And I think that the inflation and the fuel prices are still going to be the economic factors that increase the resentment towards him and push down on his popularity. And I think the Democratic Party is going to suffer some tough, midterm results. And I really think that as much as, Biden, he did, make these references to standing with the people of Ukraine and all of that, I really think that this is not going to be a war that can salvage his presidency. I think he's disappointed a lot of core constituents. If you recall, Black voters were critical in getting him into the presidency, but he has not been able to effect any legislation in their favor. But, right now the anti-Asian hate bill has been passed. And that's something that African Americans look at as, okay, we were your priority constituency. Clyburn was critical to getting you in and pushing away the Sanders vote. But we have gotten nothing to show for that. And maybe a Supreme Court appointment is a symbolic appointment and an overture that I'm trying, but I don't know that it's enough of an effort at a street level where African Americans can say, yeah, you've done something for us.
That's an interesting take. Phil, do you have anything to say about Joe Biden?
No, look, I'm not a big follower of American politics, if I'm honest, but I perceive Joe Biden as the anybody but Trump candidate, and he was always going to be holding the seat warm for whoever comes next. But I mean, he clearly is not a strong president, and I don't think he's got a bright future ahead of him. Let's put it that way.
I don't think he even knows where he is most of the time. Phumi, anything from you on this?
I don't underestimate.
He did call the people of Ukraine the people of Iran. Unironic.
No, don't underestimate what damage that Afghan war has done to the psyche of Americans about wars in general. Right? So I think the American people currently have no appetite for any war. And unfortunately, a big war is what their economy and most of Europe's economy needs. They need a war because that war machine is such a big money spinner on many fronts, and has a long tail in terms of the people that it benefits. But they don't have an appetite for it. And I think, unfortunately for Sleepy Joe, this is this is not gonna bode well for him. Not in the midterm.
You mentioned the long tail, but that tail sometimes wags the dog, and that was a brilliant movie that I think opened a lot of people's eyes to just how cynical that whole industrial military complex in America is, and how politicians use it to their advantage.
Absolutely. And I mean, if we look at what's happened since in the past 24 hours. 24, maybe 72 hours. There is, even before the vote, the UN has made a decision to send troops and weapons into the Ukraine.
Yep.
Britain is sending military and arms. Obviously, they're sending the arms not as a gift or donation. They're sending those arms at a cost. And they've agreed to loans. For the Ukrainians are going to find out exactly how expensive it is to engage in war, but even more expensive to have friends like Britain and America, because those loans have interest. Loans have interest. This is what the British learned. This is Churchill, well documented, what Churchill learned after World War II, what the cost of America's help in the war was. Yeah. Lots of loans.
Right.
So
Well, we are living undoubtedly through some turbulent history here, and you can't say that the last few years have been boring. I mean, maybe one day we'll all have stories to tell our grandchildren, and if we live long enough, our great grandchildren. But when people look back on these 3 years with Corona, with this current situation in Russia and the Ukraine, with the madness of American politics, and even here in South Africa, I think they'll have plenty to talk about. It's always good to have you on, Jamie, and great to see you again. Thank you for your contribution this morning. And Phil, it's always good to see you too. I will give you the opportunity to talk more about Cape Independence, because I think there are probably a lot of people who want to hear more about that. And in the meantime, thanks for your bit today. Pums, we'll see you next week. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, Gareth. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.